"Oh, Ahab," cried Starbuck, "not too late is it, even now, the third day, to desist? See, Moby Dick seeks thee not. It is thou, that madly seekest him." What's up, guys? It's the host. You're watching The Gray Medium, and today I am doing my fifth and final video essay on Herman Melville's Moby Dick. If you're unfamiliar with the series, I've essentially broken Herman Melville's Moby Dick up into 5 sections. Chapters 1 through 25, 26 through 50, 51 through 75, 76 through 100, and 101 through 135. I have a video for each of those corresponding sets of chapters, and I'll make sure that the other 4 are linked in the description down below if you'd like to check those out as well. More specifically, however, for today's video, I'm going to be focusing on chapters 100 through 135 for this 5th and final part of my Moby Dick series. And if you're new to The Gray Medium, this is the channel where I'm constantly trying to find the balance between black and white, or in my case, mind and body. So regardless of if I'm hitting the hiking trails to get my body right, or if I'm hitting the library to get my mind right, I'm always trying to do something self-improvement related. So if you're interested in a more athletic video like this one, I'll make sure to link it in the description down below. Or if you want to check out some more academic content like this video, I'll make sure to link that in the description down below as well. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump back into Herman Melville's Moby Dick. So for this video in particular, I'm going to be covering the 5 chapters as follows. Chapter 108, Ahab and the Carpenter. Chapter 112, the Blacksmith. Chapter 113, the Forge. Chapter 119, the Candles, and chapter 123, the Musket. If at any point you want to see one chapter in particular, all of those will be linked with timestamps in the description down below. Without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 108, Ahab and the Carpenter. So this chapter starts out with the Carpenter on board the Pequod essentially outlining how it is that this ivory leg that he is creating for Captain Ahab, explaining how this leg is invulnerable and explaining how this leg isn't susceptible to the problems that a flesh leg would be vulnerable to, and it doesn't require the maintenance and the upkeep that a human flesh leg would need and would require. On page 511, the text reads, "Those buckskin legs and calves of legs I've seen in shop windows wouldn't compare at all. They soak water. They do, and of course get rheumatic, and have to be doctored, with washes and lotions just like live legs." Another thing that I won't dive too deep into right now, but I do want to touch up on in relation to part 2, my second video on my Moby Dick video essay series, is the use of the word white as an adjective, and the way in which white was seen as good, or holy, or pure, as, you know, a descriptor of different things. And in this case, it is used as a descriptor of white fire or of a white flame. On the next page, page 512, there are some pretty interesting comments on white heat for this kind of quote-unquote fine work. So I'm not going to dive too deep into that, but if you have been following this series, I would really encourage you to apply what it is that we acknowledged in the earlier videos and in the earlier chapters, more specifically chapter 42, the whiteness of the whale, and read that chapter again and try to apply that to what it is that we're being given here by Melville. But ultimately, circling back around to this whole morality thing, we see that comment from the Carpenter on page 511 talking about how it is that this ivory leg doesn't require that maintenance that the flesh leg would. However, the chapter begins to explore how it is that a flesh leg has some advantages that the ivory leg doesn't, despite being vulnerable. While discussing these pros and cons between man and machine, Ahab goes off on another one of his crazed rants. He starts talking about an idealized automaton, and he describes it here on the bottom of page 512. The text reads, "I'll order a complete man after a desirable pattern. In premise, 50 feet high in his socks, then chest modeled after the Thames Tunnel, then legs with roots to 'em to stay in place, then arms 3 feet through the wrist, no heart at all, brass forehead, and about 1/4 of an acre of fine brains. And let me see, shall I order eyes to see outwards? No, but put a skylight on the top of his head to illuminate inwards. There, take the order and away." And to this partially arrogant, partially playful, but also partially serious considering what we know about Ahab up until this point in the novel, request, we then hear a response from the Carpenter on the next page, 513, when he explains, "'Tis but indifferent architecture to make a blind dome." I found this to be a really interesting part of the chapter in particular, because Ahab is essentially claiming that this idealized man would be devoid of emotion and would be devoid of human attributes. He says that this automaton would have no heart at all, but he also states here that he would have about 1/4 of an acre of fine brains. Ahab is obviously trying to remove the human emotion from this machine, this idealized machine that he's talking about, hypothetically speaking, but he's essentially trying to say that the emotion of man, man having a heart, man having conscience, is part of what makes him susceptible to these problems that an automaton would not be susceptible to. Part of the arrogance in Ahab's comments is kind of outlined by the idea that he blatantly says that he wouldn't order for eyes to see outwards, but rather he would order for a skylight on the top of his head to illuminate inwards, which, as far as I'm concerned, seems to be a blatant comment about Ahab saying that this idealized man, right, this automaton that would, essentially replace man, wouldn't actually need to actively recognize things other than itself and to have the heart and the conscience and the empathy and the sympathy in order to actually recognize things other than itself. It would simply just need to be admired as its own thing and itself to be admired, which is funny because Ahab is, as we know, one of the most narcissistic characters in this entire novel, if not the most narcissistic character in this entire novel. So an answer like that really makes sense, especially coming from him. And as Melville has done so well throughout the course of this novel, he allows the Carpenter to be a character similar to Starbuck, who then offers a voice of reason, who then challenges this ignorance and this narcissism that's provided by Ahab, when he blatantly states that this would be indifferent architecture to make a blind dome, to make a dome that doesn't actually have to accept or process anything other than itself, would truly make this creature indifferent, and it would represent the ignorance of its creator, in this case Ahab. It's funny looking at this and understanding Ahab's relation to his ivory leg and how it is that that impacts his comments here, because we do notice throughout the course of this novel that no matter how much the Carpenter may try to deprive this ivory peg leg of its human attributes and of its limitations that would be present in its human counterpart, Ahab still feels phantom pains attached to his now missing leg, and he will always attach his ivory peg leg to himself as if it were an extension of his own being. So in that case, I think that this chapter in large part is really pointing to this idea that it's not invulnerability that makes man great, but rather consciousness. So the next chapter that I really want to touch up on is chapter 112, The Blacksmith. So we get some weird descriptors of the blacksmith. He's really described almost as this really quiet, to himself kind of guy who just toils away at his work. He's really to himself. He doesn't really talk to people. He almost seems miserable. And chapter 112 really allows us to kind of dive into his lore and to understand his backstory as a character. The chapter explains how the blacksmith on board the Pequod was named Perth, and it explains how back home on shore during an earlier period of his life, Perth was described to have had 4 acts of gladness. These 4 acts consisted of owning a house and a garden, a youthful wife, 3 children, and a consistent habit of going to church on Sunday. Despite this seemingly blessed past, his entire existence that we see within the novel Moby Dick is just constantly miserable, and it just seems like his life is just constant suffering. This is talked about here on page 527. The text reads, "Nevertheless, this old man's was a patient hammer wielded by a patient arm. No murmur, no impatience, no petulance did come from him. Silent, slow, and solemn, bowing over still further his chronically broken back, he toiled away as if toil were life itself. And the heavy beating of his hammer, the heavy beating of his heart, and so it was, most miserable." Now, these 4 acts of gladness obviously don't contribute to this constant miserable feeling that Perth is suffering from. What causes this constant suffering is what the text describes as a 5th act of grief. Now, I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that this fifth act of grief is really vague, and I think that each person who approaches this text might read into it differently and might understand what this fifth act of grief is differently. So when I'm talking about this fifth act of grief right now, I'm talking about it as I understand it, but there may be someone who understands this text better than I, who might give you a more accurate representation of what it is that this fifth act of grief really is, but based off of the textual clues, I'm going to explain it as I understand it. So from what I understand, it seems as if Perth was already suffering with alcoholism, which, when paired with the death of his older brother, left him, quote, worse than useless. So in other words, Perth was already drinking, and then when his older brother died, the grief overcame him, and then he became consumed by his alcoholism, which eventually led him to destroying his family and his 4 acts of gladness. I say this because of what the text says here on page 528. The text reads, "He was an old man who at the age of nearly 60 had postponedly encountered that thing in sorrow's technicals called ruin." A few lines down within the same paragraph, the text continues, "But one night, under cover of darkness and further concealment in a most cunning disguisement, a desperate burglar slid into his happy home and robbed them all of everything. And darker yet to tell, the blacksmith himself did ignorantly conduct this burglar into his family's heart. It was the bottle conjurer. Under the opening of the fatal cork, forth flew the fiend and shriveled up his home." One way or another, Perth had no desire to live, but he was unwilling to take his own life. Hence the reason why he chose to sign up to go a whaling. He couldn't live with what he had done, he couldn't live with his life, but he also didn't have the nerve to kill himself, so he saw whaling as an opportunity to go really pursue his death wish. So it's in that way that Perth went a whaling as a way of welcoming death. It's in this way that going into the unknown, going into the sea, can be compared to going into the uncertainty that is found in death. We don't know what's on the other side of death, and similarly, we don't know what's in the deepest, darkest, most treacherous parts of the sea. So it's in this way that going out to sea is really allegorical to him welcoming his death and him going out to his death. And considering what we know by the time we finish the book, spoiler alert, Perth dies, we find out that his wish is fulfilled, and we find out that in that sea that brings all of that unknowing, it also brings death, which brings in an enormous, seemingly infinite amount of further unknowing. On page 529, the text comments on this, "Come hither, put up thy gravestone, too, within the churchyard, and come hither, till we marry thee." That text in particular talking about marrying Perth with his inevitable death that will be found at sea. And in the next paragraph on the same page, page 529, the text again continues, "Hearkening to these voices, east and west, by early sunrise and by fall of eve, the blacksmith's soul responded, I come. And so Perth went a whaling." And it's in this way that I begin to really feel sad for Perth, and it's in this way that readers begin to really see that dark place that Perth has fallen into as he starts seeing whaling as a means to an end, and he starts seeing whaling as a means to ending his own life. And obviously all of this information does a great job of setting up the next chapter, chapter 113, The Forge. So as this chapter begins, Ahab approaches the blacksmith Perth while he's working in the forge, and he begins to make comments on how Perth is seemingly unaffected by the sparks and the embers. And it's from this point that we get a really interesting commentary here provided on emotional numbness, and I found that it really relates back to the previous chapter really well. And I think a large part of what it is that Melville is getting at here at this chapter is that Perth remains invulnerable to the physical pain of the embers from this forge hitting him simply because the emotional pain that he has been burdened with will always stand taller than the physical pain that is present within his day-to-day life. It's in this way that we could look at this blacksmith analogy and we could really say that any seam or dent may be made smooth, yet the dent or the seam of man's consciousness can never truly be repaired. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever. I don't know if I did the book any justice there, so let's go ahead and just pull the text directly from the chapter itself. After approaching Perth as he's working in the forge, Ahab asks, "They burn, but thou livest among them without a scorch." Perth responds to Captain Ahab by saying, "Because I am scorched all over, Captain Ahab." answered Perth, resting for a moment on his hammer. I am past scorching. Not easily canst thou scorch a scar. And knowing how great of a blacksmith Perth is, and Melville just being absolutely amazing with this comparison and this analogy he's making between forging something and repairing something that is made of steel compared to, trying to forge something or trying to repair something that is made of man, he then continues here on page 531 when Captain Ahab asks again, "And I suppose thou canst smooth almost any seams and dents. Never mind how hard the metal, Blacksmith." To which Perth again responds, "Aye, sir, I think I can. All seams and dents but one." So, knowing what we know, having read the previous chapter, this seam or this dent is very obviously Perth himself, and it's obvious that he's actively struggling and he's actively living through this pain that he's endured throughout his life. And the physical act of him repairing metal and doing metal work is running alongside his inability to actually repair himself and to actually heal his own heart. No matter the number of tools or weapons or harpoons or anvils or anchors that he fixes, he can never fix his own heart. And it's for that reason that there's this inverse relationship between the physical work that he does as a blacksmith in his forge and the mental, emotional, and spiritual work that he is simply incapable doing as a man. These conditions and these experiences that Perth has endured throughout his life have seriously scarred him and left him broken beyond repair. And it's for this reason that I feel like this is another great example of how it is that Melville uses one chapter to set up another. If you were to just randomly read chapter 113 without having read 112, this chapter may not have made a lot of sense, but having read this chapter directly after having read chapter 112, these two really add on to one another and complement one another in an absolutely amazing way. The next chapter I'm going to be breaking down is chapter 119, The Candles. Early on within this chapter, the text makes it a point to outline how it is that these Japanese seas have the worst of all storms, a storm called the typhoon. I don't remember exactly how it is that this happened, but one way or another, the three masts were struck with lightning, or somehow the three masts ended up on fire, and they started to be described as the three candles. And it's in the way that these three wooden masts on the Pequod being lit on fire began to portray a sense of sublime terror. And I think this terror is sublime in the way that it's attributed to nature, and it's attributed to nature personified, and nature being portrayed as something greater than man, and man being portrayed as something that must be subservient to and at the will of nature. On page 546, the text reads, "So, too, it is that in these resplendent Japanese seas, the mariner encounters the direst of all storms, the typhoon." Mariner, I don't know. Anyways, point is not necessarily what the text is saying within this caption, but more importantly, how it's saying it. When we look at the way that this is written within the text, we could see that obviously Japanese is capitalized, but mariner, I don't know, however you want to say it, is not capitalized. But then the name of this storm in particular, typhoon, is spelled with a capital T. It is capitalized. And I feel like when we really look at this text and we look at this caption in particular, it is working to assert man as subservient, as inferior to this storm, and these candles are really a representation of that. Men on board the Pequod, Starbuck included, begin to explain how it is that, look, these masts being on fire is very obviously a bad omen. This is very obviously nature. This is very obviously God, or this is very obviously some sort of supernatural entity intervening with this voyage and intervening with this whaling chase, and blatantly trying to warn the men on board the Pequod that they are on a path that leads to their own end. They're on a path that leads to their own deaths. They're on a path that leads to nothing other than corruption and destruction. Yet Ahab, being just the monomaniac captain that he is, being the arrogant asshole that he is, he begins to claim that because these masts go down into the lower sections of the ship that are housing these casks of sperm oil harvested from the sperm whales, he's claiming that these masts being on fire is really a good omen, because they are burning the oil that they harvested from these whales. These masts that are lit on fire, in the words of Ahab, are all of the sudden candles that are showing them that there is value in what they're doing and that there is reason for them to continue on hunting sperm whales and to continue to try to collect this spermaceti oil that is, according to him, fueling these candles that are burning from the ship. It's in this way that Ahab is claiming that these candles are going to light the Pequod's way to Moby Dick. And Starbuck, being one of the few sane people still on board the Pequod, tries to tell Ahab, no man, this is God actively telling us we're on the wrong path, we need to redirect, we need to do a 180, we need to abandon this mission of trying to kill Moby Dick, and Ahab is just not having it. The men on board are almost just gaslit and completely just manipulated by Ahab's propaganda, and despite Starbuck's attempts to actually speak some reason into these men, ultimately Ahab's word reigns superior and they end up following suit with what their captain believes. But beyond the argument of if this is a good omen or a bad omen, obviously knowing what we know, it was a bad one. There is also another conversation that's had here, which is really interesting regarding the quote-unquote heathens who are on board the ship. If this is the first of the Moby Dick videos you're watching, first things first, I would recommend going back and watching those first as prerequisite understanding what it is that I'm talking about now. But in the event that you haven't, the three chief mates, or the three second mates really, Tashtego, Queequeg, and Dago, are all portrayed as heathens, especially when they're illuminated by this light from these three candles. Page 549 reads, "Relieved against the ghostly light, the gigantic jet Dago loomed up to thrice his real stature, and seemed the black cloud from which the thunder had come. That parted mouth of Tashtego revealed his shark-white teeth, which strangely gleamed as if they too had been tipped by corpusants. While lit up by the preternatural light, Queequeg's tattooing burned like satanic blue flames on his body." And it's sections like this that really make me want to encourage readers to start to apply Jungian archetypes to Melville's work. Obviously we know that Melville came before Carl Jung, but it's in this way that we could look at the light provided by these candles and we could see the way that these quote-unquote heathens are portrayed differently when they are illuminated by this light, and we could start to see how Melville, in certain ways, is kind of illuminating the shadow of these men in a Jungian sense. Or in other words, this flame, this good omen, this bad omen, whatever you want to call it, is essentially glorifying or glamorizing these men to be whatever it is that men like Ahab, or whatever it is that the white Christian men on board are perceiving them to be, or whatever it is that their confirmation bias wants these men to be. Because characters like Queequeg, Tashtego, and Dagu are not white Christian men, they obviously are going to be denounced, they obviously are going to be looked down upon, and the white men on board the ship are obviously going to look at them differently because they don't share the same skin color, the same race, or the same religion as the other men do. And it's through this light that's provided by these candles that these seemingly negative attributes that are attributed to these quote-unquote heathens are then blown out of proportion and then like glamorized and used to make these characters seem almost as if they really are evil people. And amidst all of this conversation of the candles, amidst this imagery of these heathens, throughout it all, we're constantly reminded of this fact that no one escapes death. And this is touched up on here on page 550 by Melville when he writes, "To neither love nor reverence wilt thou be kind, and Eden for hate thou canst but kill, and are all killed. No fearless fool now fronts thee." And it's in this moment that the book gets really intense, and reading this chapter, I began to just white-knuckle the book because this is a major turning point in the trajectory of the Pequod and all of its crew. And like I said earlier, every time that a character like Starbuck tries to really speak some logic into these men and really tries to reason with these men, it's then that Ahab is then able to hoorah, and he's able to give this pep talk that then wrestles these men and all of their free will back into Ahab's hands. This is displayed beautifully here on page 551 when Ahab explains, "But war is pain, and hate is woe. Come in thy lowest form of love, and I will kneel and kiss thee. but at thy highest come as mere supernal power, and though thou launchest navies of full frighted worlds, there's that in here that still remains indifferent. O thou clear spirit, of thy fire thou madest me, and like a true child of fire, I breathe it back to thee. And it's through this quote that we recognize that Ahab knows that he can't fool death. He knows that he will face his death, yet he still chooses to hunt Moby Dick even though he knows God does not approve of his mission. In a last plea to speak some sense into Ahab, Starbuck says, God is against thee. Old man, forbear. 'Tis an ill voyage, ill begun, ill continued. Let me square the yards, while we may, old man, and make a fair wind of it homewards, to go on a better voyage than this. But as we know, Starbuck's comments are to no avail. The Pequod continues onward. The final chapter that I want to discuss for Herman Melville's Moby Dick is chapter 123, The Musket. So it's during this typhoon that the Pequod is sailing through that Starbuck wants to go report to Ahab. So Starbuck makes his way to Captain Ahab's quarters when he starts to recognize that not only is Ahab asleep, but outside of Ahab's cabin, there's also loaded muskets that are mounted on the wall. Starbuck, being a man of good character, really struggles to recognize the thoughts that he begins to have as his own. However, Starbuck isn't alone in thinking that Ahab is absolutely crazed and demented at this point, and he's not alone in thinking that Ahab is actively putting everyone's lives in danger. So after instinctually taking a loaded musket off of the wall, Starbuck begins to stand there and question the ethics and the morality of killing Ahab in his sleep, and he really starts to entertain this utilitarian idea of doing the action that would do the most amount of people the greatest amount of good. And he starts entertaining this idea of killing Ahab as a means of protecting everyone else on board the Pequod. While discussing the risk of actually allowing Ahab to sail these men to their doom, Starbuck makes this comment here. The text reads, "But shall this crazed old man be tamely suffered to drag a whole ship's company down to doom with him? Yes, it would make him the willful murder of 30 men and more, if this ship come to any deadly harm. And come to deadly harm, my soul swears this ship will, if Ahab have his way." Obviously, what it is that Starbuck is referring to here is the fact that Ahab is crazy, and he knows that Ahab is most likely going to sail all of these men to their ultimate end. He is going to inevitably get everyone on board the Pequod killed. If killing Ahab is a means of protecting these men on board the Pequod, and if Starbuck knows that killing Ahab will allow him to protect the lives of the men on board the Pequod, then he may see this as a necessary evil, and this is the reason why he's really contemplating taking Ahab's life, because he does believe that ultimately it will serve a greater number of people. And it's in this way that this chapter really allows us to see the interiority of Starbuck as a character. In previous chapters, the only way that we really get to approach Starbuck as a character is from a more third-person perspective, in which we're just learning about him by his dialogue and learning about him by the way that he interacts with other characters. But this chapter in particular really allows us to kind of walk a mile in his shoes and understand his thought process as he's contemplating killing his captain, again, as a means of protecting everyone else on board the Pequod. And ultimately, Starbuck chooses not to kill Ahab, and he has a few different reasons, and one of the reasons is obviously the ethical decision of him not wanting to be a murderer, but another big part of it is just the fact that he is absolutely terrified to even try. He knows that even trying to kill Ahab, given the fact that Ahab is sleeping and that he can get the jump on him with a loaded musket, still terrifies Starbuck, and I think that that's a testament to the fact that Ahab really has completely just gaslit and manipulated everyone on board this ship into being terribly afraid of him, and to a certain extent, this fear is very rational. Knowing what we know now, I don't think that this should be a spoiler, but knowing what we know now, obviously Starbuck would have saved a lot of lives had he chose to take Ahab's life, but we also have seen circumstances with characters like Perth where decisions that they make or decisions that they don't make can haunt them and have a negative impact on their lives for the remainder of their lives. So interesting there. I feel for Starbuck, that's a difficult decision, but nonetheless, I think that was the perfect final chapter to cover for Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And ultimately, I do find it super important for me to end my 5-part video series on Herman Melville's Moby Dick on chapter 123, the Musket specifically. I deliberately aimed, especially towards the end of this series, to really pull back as much as I could and to step away from the A storyline of the Pequod actually pursuing Moby Dick. Obviously, I'm doing that in large part to encourage you guys as readers to go read the book yourself, and if you want to follow that A storyline, to do it yourself as you're reading and to have that experience for yourself rather than to have someone else explain it for you. But I'm also doing this in large part to really encourage you not just to look at the literal story of Ishmael and Ahab and the Pequod pursuing Moby Dick, but more importantly to look at the social and the emotional and the psychological issues that Melville is using Moby Dick as a platform to discuss. So obviously, if you want to pursue the chase, I'm sure you could go read that for yourself, but what I was trying to do is to encourage you to apply those different lenses and to really look at the text from a variety of different angles in order to find deeper meaning in the story contained within Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And throughout this entire process of reading this book, writing papers on it in school, turning around writing video essays on it for my own personal projects, I've really recognized that there's an overarching theme that is present within Moby Dick. And I think that big theme is really the idea that the human condition is a difficult one. The human experience is filled with trials and tribulations and experiences that can really change who you are as a character. So it's through evaluating these characters like Ishmael, Ahab, the Blacksmith, Starbuck, Stubb. It's through evaluating these characters and understanding their perspectives that I really want readers to understand how it is that they're going to approach their white whale. Their white whale being the thing that justifies the suffering that is inevitable in the human condition. The white whale being the thing that drives them forward and continues to provide meaning towards the day-to-day struggles and the trials and tribulations that come along with the human experience. That being said, the only thing left to say is just encouraging you to go read the book for yourself. So like I said earlier, if you are interested in watching an athletic video, I'll make sure to have this one linked in the description down below. And if you're interested in checking out other academic content, I'll make sure to have this video linked in the description down below as well. Of course, I appreciate you greatly if you've made it this far in the video. If you enjoyed, leave a like, leave a comment down below to start a discussion, and of course, subscribe if you're new. Until next time, I'm the host, you're watching The Gray Medium. Stay gray.